Welcome back, guys. Now today we are going to be talking about paranormal type horror movies. I think out of all of the subgenres of the horror movie, I think that the paranormal type, especially with the possessions, are the scariest type of horror movies that have come out in the past decades. And today I want to give some examples of some of the best horror movies that are paranormal and kind of explore the type of possessions and those type of scary movies, especially for the month of October. I think for the month of October, this video is going to be very fitting and is going to give up some recommendations for maybe some horror films you guys have already heard of or some that you guys might get into. The first thing I want to talk about when it comes to these 5 movies that I'm going to be talking about that go under the paranormal subgenre is what makes these films a great horror film. And to me personally, I think that a great horror film just isn't great because of the horror that's in it, but in general, it's really a good movie. A common through line you guys are going to see when I talk about these 5 films is that they have great characters, usually a pretty decent to smart protagonist, and some smart characters are surrounding the protagonist, not to the extent that it's like almost super genius characters, but at the same time there aren't the run-of-the-mill like kind of dumb characters that you expect in every single horror film. They aren't your standard dumb characters that always get trapped in the woods, end up tripping over something, and they end up getting killed because of it. These are like characters that you actually think about as having great arcs in the story, and of course having great character development, and having also great support characters that kind of add to the ambiance of the horror film. As the story progresses, there's a mystery component to each of the movies, and you want to dive deeper and deeper into the story, not just because it's a horror film, because you're actually interested into solving the mystery of the film. One of the most popular ones, especially over the past decade, has been the paranormal type of horror movie. And when I mean paranormal, I mean usually involving some sense of ghost, some out of the nowhere type of ambiance, kind of the sense that everything is uncontrollable, that the characters are undergoing some type of peril that they can't physically control. Like a murder mystery, there's not specifically a physical killer involved. One of the most recent films that's come out this year, I think Evil Dead Rise was a really good example of kind of one that does the possession type of horror movie really well and introduces some cool new kind of mythical characters and adds to the Evil Dead universe as well. Why are people so scared of the paranormal? I think for a lot of audience members, to a certain extent, especially in the United States, I think it might be because of some religious upbringing. Maybe because I was raised Catholic, but I think there's a certain spiritual component that kind of scares everybody, and kind of delving deeper and deeper into that type of world, deeper into the dark side of the spiritual world. I think it's where a lot of people kind of get spooked, and this is why the paranormal genre has kind of become so popular nowadays. It's because it's something that isn't really talked about as much in terms of like the general public isn't really talking about it. It's kind of kept hush-hush throughout a lot of people's lives. Audience members kind of enjoy like going through that roller coaster of the mystery into going deeper and deeper into the kind of these ghost stories, because it's a way of not doing it in real life. It's just you viewing it through the lens of another movie. I think there's also an element of surprise when it comes to revealing what this paranormal thing is and kind of trying to find some sort of name to attach it to kind of give it some sense of normalcy into the world of the characters and the story in general. Before I talk about the main 5 movies that I really want to talk about, I just want to give kind of an honorable mention to James Wan and his film, because I think for a lot of people, The Conjuring and Insidious were the 2 universes where a lot of people got introduced and kind of stuck with the paranormal genre, and watching these kind of great horror films and these possessions with The Conjuring and Insidious kind of live on even today. We've seen so many new movies that have come out, even though they haven't been great movies. They've still been creating them throughout the past couple years, and even this year, I think The Nun 2 just came out, and that's within the Conjuring universe. So seeing James Wan's kind of influence earlier in the years from those 2 movies to now, I think is just showing how strong the paranormal universe is. For the horror genre, I think the paranormal and the possession type of movies are some of the main horror movies that still make probably the most money today, if I had to guess. So shout out to James Wan as an honorable mention. when it comes to kind of redefining and kind of showcasing how great the paranormal and horror genre can still be. The first movie I want to talk about is a movie that came out in 2007, the same year as Paranormal Activity, but in this case it is not Paranormal Activity, and it's kind of another kind of found footage type of horror film. And some of you may have seen it already. It's called REC, in other words, Record, and it's by two Spanish film directors, kind of in a documentary style, which is pretty cool. As we see through the beginning of the movie, we're shown kind of this opening scene of going through the everyday lives of a fireman in Spain. The realism in the first opening scene of the movie kind of drags onto the rest of the horror film and kind of makes every single scene feel more and more realistic, because of how the way it's shot in kind of this found footage sort of way, which isn't super new at the time. We saw the Blair Witch early on, obviously in the 1990s, and that kind of started that movement. And then we get Paranormal Activity in the same year as this movie, which kind of brought into a new wave of found footage horror movies in 2007. But in general, I think that this movie really does so well at kind of blending kind of this found footage horror and kind of body horror within the paranormal genre, but at the same time it kind of brings some cool moments of humor and levity in these darker scenes. The funniest moments is as each interaction happens, there's always a moment to record, and the cameraman is always getting accused of like, why the hell are you recording during this dark time? And I think that's just one of the great moments in this movie. Like, there's always, even with the side characters, there's just great moments that are just really funny within the movie. I think the ending specifically is really great. I think it brings a lot of good scares, especially the last minute or so of the movie. I think the last minute of the movie is probably one of the best parts of it. It just kind of builds up to this grand kind of moment of suspense throughout the movie that we've kind of been waiting for, in terms of finding out what exactly is happening with the possessions. And it just leaves the door open, of course, to like what's gonna happen with the rest of the building. I really think this movie is better than Paranormal Activity, as like some more funnier moments, but also does the scares really well, similar to Paranormal Activity in the found footage way. But because we're following this reporter and kind of the cameraman, we're always stuck with them and we get their perspective as we follow throughout the entire building. And it just brings these great small moments of horror, which each of the new characters is introduced through their eyes. We're seeing it as well. And there's just a more engaging story overall when it comes to Record. Next horror movie I'm going to talk about came out in 2016, and that is South Korean film The Wailing. You might have heard of this movie already, but I think it's one of the best horror movies that have taken place overseas in the past decade. I think it does the possession especially different compared to the other movies. I think there's more of a spiritual, history when it comes to The Wailing. It kind of delves deeper and deeper into kind of the cultural aspects of the paranormal genre, and kind of how each country has like a different view of what a possession could mean in terms of for the characters themselves, but also because of kind of the religion surrounding it. Because there's a character like the shaman in The Wailing, which we don't really see in other like possession films outside maybe like the priest kind of stereotype. It's delving deeper and deeper into the cultural aspects of Japan and Korea, which is something I haven't seen done before in other paranormal type of horror films. It's usually more something along the lines of biblical, or it's just some other kind of fantastical type of spirit. Wailing specifically targets kind of the cultural use of the possessions, and kind of delves deeper into this South Korean history and the cultural aspects of a possession. What I really like with The Wailing is that it kind of blends in the detective, not really film noir, but still the detective type of thriller story, along with the possession, following the main character, whose daughter is obviously dealing with kind of these possessions as well. There are some moments of humor within the main protagonist especially. I think that the main actor does these great facial expressions really well, like especially when he's in the forest, or if he gets stumbled when he interacts with the Japanese man initially. The character is not just being kind of a stereotypical detective, but more of kind of an everyman detective. He's really just searching for an answer kind of for his daughter and kind of trying to solve this mystery surrounding these possessions that are happening. It gives a great story and not just a great horror story. It kind of provides some great narrative elements that are seen throughout a lot of great movies in general. The next movie is really a classic. I talked about kind of the stereotypical uses of the paranormal genre of having kind of a priest or it coming from a biblical sense, but I think when it comes to this movie, this one does it so well, and it kind of started that trend, and it is The Exorcist, which came out in 1973. Directed by William Friedkin, is kind of the standard in terms of, or at least the origin of where a lot of these paranormal type of horror movies come from, and kind of try to emulate that spark and that magic that the first Exorcist movie had. I really enjoyed the trailer for the new Exorcist movie that's coming out. I think it has some great potential of being a really good sequel to the series, and I hope it kind of delivers and kind of has those elements of the first movie. Throughout the paranormal genre, I think that The Exorcist has some of the most classic characters, from Ellen Burstyn as the mom to Max von Sydow as the priest and Linda Blair as obviously Reagan. And I gotta give a shout out to the makeup team of The Exorcist because it has some of the best makeup done in any horror film that's come out, even in the past couple decades. Something that surprises me from The Exorcist that's done so well, and it's not often kind of emulated or done this well, is kind of that The Exorcist is really shot mainly in a one-room house, mainly prioritizes kind of everything that happens within this one room. And it's so well done because each of the characters that come into the room and kind of interact with Ellen Burstyn and the daughter kind of get this new perspective on what's happening throughout the home and kind of what's happening with Reagan. The Exorcist definitely paved the way for the paranormal genre, and along with it, I think it has some of the best moments of dialogue in any horror film. It has some unforgettable moments and kind of hilarious moments, really, when it comes to the horror genre. It's kind of crazy how the idea of the priest and kind of there's obviously this biblical impact of why people connect so much with the idea of the possession and the paranormal environment. Next movie I want to talk about is one that I'm pretty sure all of you have already heard of and have probably watched at this point. If you're any sort of horror fan, you probably have read the book, maybe some of you, but it's just such an obvious one because of the main possession that occurs with the main character and kind of how his character influences the rest of the story. And I'm talking about The Shining, which came out in 1980, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Of course, has been talked about so many times over the past couple of years. It's been analyzed so many different ways, and for good reason, because it's definitely one of the best horror films of all time, I think. It's even influenced my number one favorite horror movie of all time. It doesn't really follow your stereotypical type of paranormal, even setting. It takes place in the Overlook Hotel, and kind of a desolate type of area. But in terms of the horror that happens within the movie, it's not really your stereotypical demonic possession. It's more about how this main character, Jack Torrance, kind of becomes even crazier and crazier throughout the movie. And his impact in the story obviously comes from his interaction with his kid and obviously with his wife, and how that the hotel kind of overtakes him and sends him down a dark path throughout the story. With the great set design and cinematography that occurs within The Shining, I think those are the two glaring points that, compared to the other horror movies on this list, kind of make it even greater of not just a great horror film, but obviously as a great film. Number one horror paranormal movie of all time is Hereditary by Ari Aster, that came out in 2018. And I've actually done a PowerPoint presentation in one of my horror film classes that I had in college. I saw Hereditary 3 times in theaters when it came out. Probably my favorite horror film of all time, but it has maintained itself as one of the best films I've seen in a while. His direction has kind of made such an impact on me and kind of how I view films, because of how meticulous he is with camera movement especially, and kind of delves deeper into the characters that he works with, and kind of tries to find a human aspect or quality to each of the characters that is obviously kind of taking a toll on them mentally, especially throughout the course of the movie. Talked about and analyzed before with this movie, the main theme of it is grief. And Toni Collette's performance in Hereditary is very similar to that of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. These two movies are probably pretty similar in a lot of ways when it comes to kind of the madness and kind of the mental psychological thriller and horror that happens with the characters throughout the movie, and kind of following them and their demise as they go deeper and deeper into kind of the spiritual aspects of the horror genre. The cinematographer Powell has worked with Ari Aster so many times now, and it's kind of shown why he is one of the best cinematographers working today. The play with shadows by Ari Aster and Powell throughout the movie, I think, is something that transcends the horror genre, because a lot of the times we kind of get a lot of silhouettes and just some kind of jump scares that are used to kind of heighten the scares. Letting the camera stay there and let it hold until the scare is over, I think, is a great component as to why Ari Aster and Powell are so great at developing kind of a new sense of horror throughout the genre. Halfway through it is mainly when this kind of twist into the paranormal sets in, right after like a tragedy that occurs within the movie. I don't want to spoil it if you guys haven't seen it yet. The best horror turning points in recent history, I think. I think it has some of the best utilization of how a story can be turned on its head. Ari Aster not only knows how to show some of the most gruesome and disturbing scenes within a movie, but he adds onto it by using those disturbing scenes, kind of building these moral quandaries for each of the characters, and adds to the moral complexity of the story. So guys, those were 5 films that I highly recommend you guys check out, and it kind of brings this theme of paranormal and possessions into the horror genre, and kind of subverts some moments, and kind of add a new perspective, and kind of makes the horror genre even better for it, and kind of let me know some of your recommendations you guys might have for some of the paranormal type of horror movies. And do you guys agree with me? Do you guys think that the paranormal genre is probably the scariest of all? Like, do you guys find the possessions and kind of these stories that are constantly told to be kind of the scariest of the horror genre? Like, for me personally, I think a lot of horror movies don't really scare me nowadays, because I know kind of what goes on in terms of the camera work, and obviously I know it's directed by somebody and it's kind of written, and I know certain parts about sound design and certain key moments like that. So I think a lot of horror movies don't really scare me nowadays, because I know what's going on behind the scenes. But I think the ones that intrigue me the most end up being kind of more psychological, and also have this element of paranormal to it. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know some of your recommendations, of course, and I hope you guys have a good one.